This is the first of two lectures on the Book of Judges. By me, my name is Dr. Joe Sprinkle. A little bit of background about the Book of Judges, authorship and date. The author is unknown. Critical scholars who accept the Deuteronomistic history theory say it was written by the Deuteronomists, but it's safer to say that we just don't know who wrote this section. As far as the date, it was written after the monarchy had begun. It says at several points, in those days there was no king in Israel. And that implies that at the time that the book was written, there were kings in Israel. It also says, therefore they shall call that place Mahane Dan until this day. And that little expression, until this day, implies that a considerable amount of time has passed since the time of the judges. Likewise, in chapter 18 and verse 30, it talks about the captivity of Dan. Well, Dan went into captivity after 732 when Tiglath-Pileser III began deportations of the population, and that probably implies that the book was completed after that date. The title is Judges, which raises the question, who is a judge? What are the judges known for? Were they known for judicial decisions? And the answer is going to be no. And if not, why call them judges? The Hebrew word for judge is shofet. Normally it means a judge in the regular sense, but in the book of Judges, it regularly refers to a military hero or deliverer who saved Israel from foreign oppression. And this is stated explicitly in Judges 2 and verse 16. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. They were military saviors rather than judges in the ordinary sense for the most part. You can divide up the judges into major judges and minor judges. The major judges are the ones that show up in the book of Judges as military leaders. To them you can list Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, Deborah, Gideon, Jephthah, and Samson. You could also add Eli and Samuel from 1 Samuel, who we know some stories about, who are both called judges. But then the minor judges, we don't know exactly what they did. They may have been conveyors of Israel's moral and legal traditions, that's a guess. But we know little more than their names. And so we know, for example, one was named Tola. He was from Issachar. One was Jair from Gilead. You have Ibzan from Judah, and Elon from Zebulun, and Abdon from Ephraim. And they're mentioned in Judges 10 and Judges 12. And all we know are their names. Chronologically, we should fit the period of the judges into history. You can say that, well, the patriarchs covered roughly 300 years from 2150 to 1850 BC. The sojourn in Egypt covered about 400 years, roughly 1850 to 1450. You might notice I'm ending everything in 50s, so I'm simplifying the history a bit. The wilderness wanderings and conquests you might call roughly 1450 to 1350. And then the period of the judges then would be roughly 1350 to 1050. That would be roughly 300 years. And then the monarchy would be from 1050 to 550, about 500 years. Now, there is a problem with the chronology of the book of Judges. It says that judges ruled for so many years, and if you add up all the years that each of the judges ruled, you end up with 407 years. But no matter how you do the chronology, there are not 407 years available. The geographic distribution of the various judges makes it clear that there may have been chronological overlap between the judges. If you look on this map, you can see how judges were active in different parts of the country. And it may be that when Ehud was doing his thing around Moab, that Deborah and Barak may have been doing their thing up north. There may have been an overlap, or Shamgar was doing his thing among the Philistines. It's not at all clear that they were entirely chronologically separate from each other, and the fact that they were active in different regions suggests that they could have been active at the same time and overlap, and that would explain the chronological problem. Now let's say a little bit about the social setting of the judges. Israel was socially rather different than the Canaanites when they first occupied the land. And extra biblical data from Elamarna and Allah and Ugarit help to fill in the social setting of the book of Judges. What did Canaanite society look like? The Canaanites were urban with independent city-states. Each city had its own king, and the Canaanites were thus much more urban than the Israelites. Moreover, Canaanite society had an aristocracy, unlike Israel. They had a strict hierarchy of kings, along with nobles and an entire aristocratic class. Israel, on the other hand, at first lacked kings and aristocracy. Canaan had a material culture that was better than Israel's. Canaanite towns are generally materially superior than Israelite towns. Their art, their architecture, and their cities were all better than Israel's, which is natural since Israel had spent 40 years in the wilderness where they couldn't develop those skills. Israelites, on the other hand, were a tribal society. Joshua 7, verses 14 through 18 confirms that Israel was loosely organized into tribes and clans and households. Israel, moreover, was a rural pastoral society. At first, Israel filled the hill country and did not occupy cities so much. Israel was a society of equals. Israel had much less social stratification than the Canaanites. There were no kings, there were no dynasties, there was no aristocratic class. And Israel, moreover, was a Amphictyony. Now, what is a Amphictyony? An Amphictyony is a loose confederacy of tribes united around a central sanctuary. The term actually comes from Greek states in the classical period. And Israel had a central sanctuary. The sanctuary was the tabernacle, and they were loosely organized around that tabernacle. But they were largely independent of each other. After the death of Joshua, there was no central government, but rather when there was a need, God would raise up a temporary leader, a judge, who would be a charismatic leader who would unite the tribes for a period of time. But when the judge died, they go back to being independent again. Now let me say a little bit about Canaanite religion. Canaanites were polytheistic. Their main god was the god El. He was the head of the Canaanite pantheon originally. He was said to be the father of the other gods. And the word El is actually the common Semitic word for God. You find it in Hebrew and in Arabic and other Semitic languages. And some who worship El in Genesis may have been worshipers of this God rather than Yahweh. You have some of the city names like Beth-El, which is house of El in Hebrew. And there may have been a temple to El at Bethel originally. Also, you have Melchizedek, he was a priest of El. And again, was this El the same as the Israelite god El, or was this the Canaanite El? and to what degree did they overlap? We don't know for sure. The Canaanite religion had also the god Bel, and here are some representations of Bel. It was the title for the Semitic storm god Hadad. He was a nature deity who was supposed to give fertility to the land, and he was the most prominent of the Canaanite gods later on. You also have a female deity, the goddess Ashtoreth. She was the mother goddess of fertility. She was the consort of Baal in the mythology. Canaanite religion also did things somewhat similar to what Israelites did. They did sacrifices, animal sacrifice, and prayer, which is what Israel did as well. They also, however, conducted human sacrifice. This is mentioned in Leviticus 18 and verse 21, and also verse 27. Also Deuteronomy 12:31, Deuteronomy 18 verses 9 and 10. They offered human sacrifice. We also see this in a Canaanite colony. The Canaanites were related to the Phoenicians, and the Phoenicians had a colony at Carthage, and there's archaeological evidence of child sacrifice in Carthage. In this, they influenced Israel. You had kings like Ahaz in 2 Kings 16, and the northern kingdom in 2 Kings 17:17, and Manasseh in 2 Kings 21:6, and Jephthah in the book of Judges, chapter 11, all of whom performed human sacrifice. They also had a cult of the dead. There's archaeological evidence of food offerings for the dead in Canaanite tombs. And the Bible condemns this kind of thing and condemns all necromancy, the veneration of the dead. But that's what the Canaanites did. One question that comes up, did the Canaanites practice what is called sacred prostitution? And it's a common view, you'll read in commentaries, that the Canaanites practiced a fertility cult of prostitution, which would involve ritual sex with the priestess in a form of sympathetic magic to give fertility to the land. We do know that prostitutes were known to have worked in the service of temples of goddesses of love. You have that in Greek culture. Herodotus mentions this also in the ancient Near East for the Ishtar temple. According to Herodotus, Mesopotamian women had to prostitute themselves once in a lifetime in the Ishtar temple to a stranger. But that said, there's not all that strong of evidence that there is a general fertility cult among the Canaanites, even though that's captured the imagination of a lot of people, and you'll find that in the literature. It may be the case that it happened some, but that it was a general practice is not yet proven. The bottom line is that Israel ultimately came to adopt many of the pagan practices that they learned from the materially superior Canaanites during the period of the Judges. Israel was concentrated at first in the hill country, whereas the Canaanites lived in cities in the more fertile valleys. If you look at the map here, you have the coastal plain, which was very fertile, and then you have the foothills, the Shephelah, which is not mentioned in the map, but that's what it's called. But then you had the central mountainous area, and it would be more in the mountainous areas that the Canaanites allowed the Israelites to settle, because that was less good territory, frankly. Now, what happened was that the Israelites failed to drive the Canaanites completely out. And this is described in Judges chapter 1:1 through chapter 2 and verse 5. It says in chapter 1 and verse 19, the Lord was with the men of Judah. They took possession of the hill country, again, concentrating in the mountainous region. But they were unable to drive out the people from the plains because they had iron chariots. And then verse 21, the Benjaminites, however, failed to dislodge the Jebusites who were living in Jerusalem. To this day, the Jebusites live there with the Benjaminites. And then Judges 1:27, but Manasseh did not drive out the people of Bethshan or Taanach or Dor or Ibleam or Megiddo and their surrounding settlements. Verse 28, when the Israelites became strong, they pressed the Canaanites into forced labor, but never drove them out completely. Nor did Ephraim drive out the Canaanites living in Gezer. Neither did Zebulun drive out the Canaanites living in Kitron or Nahalol. But they did subject them to forced labor. Nor did Asher drive out those living in Akko or Sidon or Ahlab or Ekzib or Helbah or Aphek or Rehob. Neither did Naphtali drive out those living in Beth Shemesh or Beth Anath. Now, why did Israel get bogged down? From the book of Joshua, we might suppose that Israel went from victory to victory. Joshua helped Israel, however, get a foothold in the land. It was never a full occupation. It was left up to the tribes after the time of Joshua to fully occupy the land. While Joshua was alive, the Israelites did well, but when he died, a new generation arose that turned away from the Lord to idolatry. As it says in Judges 2 and verse 10, after that whole generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation grew up who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. And this leads to cycles of oppression in Judges. Judges chapter 2, verses 11 through 23. The cycles of oppression look like this. Step 1, they would sin. They would do what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And step 2, in response, the Lord would give them into the hands of oppressors, and they would become oppressed. And there were various oppressors that are mentioned, Mesopotamian oppressors, Moabites, Philistines, Canaanites, Midianites, Ammonites. The Lord would allow them to be oppressed by foreign peoples. But then, step 3, they would turn to the Lord in prayer and cry out to God. And then in response to that, the Lord would raise up a judge or a deliverer to save them. As it says in Judges 2:16, then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. But then step 5 is go back to step 1 and begin to sin again, worship the pagan gods, do the pagan practices, and the cycle would repeat over and over again. And so the book of Judges is one of cycles of oppression. This is summarized in chapter 2, but it is illustrated in the stories about the judges in the chapters that follow. Now, there is a theology of testing here, that God allowed all this to happen to test Israel's obedience. As it says in Judges 2:21 and 22, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations Joshua left when he died. I will use them to test Israel to see whether they will keep the way of the Lord and walk in it as their forefathers did. God tests people from time to time. He tested Abraham with the sacrifice of Isaac. He tested Israel in the wilderness wanderings. And now he tests Israel again in the time of the judges. Unfortunately, in the case of Israel in the wilderness and in the case of Israel in the time of the judges, they will fail that test. Well, we will look at how that happens and the cycles of oppression in the stories about the major judges that we will cover in the next lecture.